Every system believes its power is invisible until someone notices the wiring. There is a moment that almost never gets spoken about, because the people who experience it usually go quiet or get erased from the story. It's the moment when a tightly controlled group stops preaching and starts watching, not to inspire, not to recruit, but to calculate. That shift is subtle, almost polite, but once it happens, you feel it. The energy changes. The smiles linger half a second too long. Conversations suddenly circle you instead of flowing through you. Here's a fact most people miss. Cults don't collapse because of opposition. They collapse because of unexpected comprehension. Historically, the greatest threat to closed belief systems has never been rebellion. It has been individuals who understood the structure without being formally initiated into it. No slogans, no rituals, no permission, just pattern recognition. When someone grasps how authority, secrecy, language, and emotion interlock without being taught, the system treats that person as an anomaly that must be investigated. That's where this story begins, not with enlightenment, destiny, or mystical downloads, but with discomfort on their side. Because when you see through something without being inside it, the system has a problem it can't label. You weren't recruited, you weren't trained, you didn't sit at the feet of anyone important. And yet, you arrived at conclusions people spend years being coached not to reach. And this is where it gets unintentionally funny, because systems built on absolute certainty are strangely fragile. They can tolerate doubters, critics, even enemies. What they can't tolerate is someone who understands the game but refuses to play it. That's when meetings happen. That's when theories form. That's when someone somewhere starts asking how you got this information, as if insight must come with a receipt. So if you've ever felt the gaze shift from guidance to scrutiny, from inclusion to analysis, from teaching to quiet surveillance, stay right here, because what unsettles them isn't what you know. It's the fact that no one can figure out how you knew where to look. Number one, you noticed patterns they assumed were invisible. Most systems like this don't hide because they're brilliant. They hide because they rely on people staying tired, distracted, or emotionally invested enough to never step back. The structure works only when everyone is focused on their own small role. One person chants, another obeys, another enforces, another benefits. Very few are supposed to notice how these pieces lock together. You did. And that's where the discomfort started. What unsettled them wasn't that you discovered a secret document or overheard a forbidden conversation. You didn't need access. You noticed repetition, the same reactions to dissent, the same phrases used to shut down thought, the same people always exempt from consequences. Patterns don't require permission to be seen. They reveal themselves to anyone who watches long enough without needing approval or belonging. Most members confuse consistency with truth. You didn't. You noticed that every coincidence leaned in the same direction. When mistakes happened, the blame traveled downward. When success appeared, credit floated upward. When harm occurred, it was reframed as necessity. When doubt surfaced, it was labeled weakness. That kind of order doesn't happen naturally. It's designed. And once you see design, you stop mistaking it for destiny. They expected you to react emotionally, like everyone else does, to get offended, inspired, fearful, or loyal. Instead, you became observant. You watched how stories changed depending on who was listening. You noticed how rules hardened for some people and softened for others. You caught how urgency was used whenever logic started failing. Those details added up quietly, without drama. This is why they're unsettled, because pattern recognition can't be argued with. It doesn't need belief. It doesn't rely on ideology. It doesn't ask for permission. Once someone sees the wiring behind the wall never looks solid again. And the most dangerous thing, from their point of view, is not that you see it. It's that you didn't need them to teach you how. Number 2, you reacted incorrectly to information meant to control you. The information wasn't neutral. It was carefully shaped to trigger a specific response. Fear was supposed to tighten your grip on the group. Praise was meant to soften your boundaries. Warnings were designed to keep you compliant. Every story, every revelation, every exclusive truth had a job to do. It wasn't there to inform you. It was there to move you. But you didn't move the way you were supposed to. When they shared alarming ideas, you didn't panic. When they promised meaning, you didn't cling. When they hinted at punishment or reward, you didn't adjust your behavior fast enough to fit the pattern. That's when they noticed. Control systems depend on predictability. They study human reactions, the way engineers study materials. Press here, get obedience. Pull there, get loyalty. You didn't respond on cue, and that broke the rhythm. Most people absorb information emotionally first, then justify it later. You did the opposite. You listened without immediately attaching your identity to what you heard. That small delay created space. In that space, manipulation loses its grip. The message no longer enters as truth. It enters as data, and data can be examined. They expected shock, gratitude, guilt, or devotion. Instead, you showed curiosity. Not curiosity that flatters authority, but the quiet kind that doesn't rush to conclusions. You noticed when the same information was framed differently depending on the audience. You noticed when fear was introduced just before obedience was required. You noticed how special knowledge always came with invisible strings attached. That's why they became uneasy, because you didn't reject the information outright, and you didn't swallow it either. You paused. And pausing is dangerous in environments built on momentum. When someone slows the process down, cracks appear. Contradictions become obvious. Emotional pressure loses force. From their perspective, something went wrong. The material worked on everyone else. The stories produced loyalty elsewhere. The warnings created compliance in others. But with you, the formula failed. And when a system designed to control behavior encounters someone it can't steer, it doesn't ask what you think. It asks how you escaped the reaction it was counting on. Number 3, you ask questions they train people not to ask themselves. Most systems like this survive because they discourage curiosity. They don't need blind obedience alone. They need thought patterns that are predictable, controllable, and self-limiting. They teach people what to notice and what to ignore, what to accept and what to rationalize away. The skill they train above all else is self-censorship. And then you arrived, asking questions they assumed had been erased from the collective mind. These weren't public questions. They weren't designed to provoke debate or gain favor. They were private, persistent, and piercing. Why is this framed as ultimate truth? Why does obedience get rewarded more than understanding? Why are some people untouchable while others bend under minor infractions? Why is fear considered proof of legitimacy? Every question chipped at assumptions that had been layered over years of habit, repetition, and ritual. Each one revealed cracks in the narrative that everyone else was too trained to see. You didn't stop at the obvious either. You looked deeper, following the logic, or lack of it, where it led. You noticed inconsistencies and contradictions without having to be told to notice them. You observed the difference between what was preached and what was practiced, the difference between ritual and reality. That kind of questioning is dangerous for systems built on repetition and selective attention, because it doesn't just expose flaws, it rewires perception. And this is why they became unnerved. Not because questions themselves are threatening, but because the act of asking them signals independence. It signals that someone is no longer contained by the rules of the system. It signals that someone can see the framework from the outside without ever needing permission to step out. That awareness is contagious. It cannot be trained away, silenced, or explained as ignorance. Once it appears, the system can no longer assume compliance. You didn't just ask questions. You reminded them that people are capable of seeing beyond the story they were told, and that's a truth they can never unsee. Number 4, you recognized emotional manipulation faster than belief formation. Most people experience these systems like a tide. Emotions wash over them first: fear, awe, excitement, guilt. Then beliefs form as justification. That sequence is what keeps control intact. The emotional hook comes first, and by the time someone thinks critically, the loyalty or fear is already embedded. You didn't follow the tide. You watched it without letting it sweep you away, and that made all the difference. They fed emotions carefully, almost scientifically. Urgency to create panic, admiration to build dependence, shame to ensure compliance, hope to maintain attachment. Each wave was timed, tailored, and repeated until most people could barely distinguish their own instincts from the pressure being applied. You, however, recognized the machinery behind the feelings. You saw fear being packaged as guidance, hope being delivered as leverage, and guilt being framed as moral duty. You felt the emotions, yes, but you didn't let them dictate your understanding or force your choices. This is what makes someone unpredictable in a system designed for predictability. Emotional manipulation doesn't work on someone who separates the signal from the noise. You notice the intention behind the delivery, the pattern behind the response. That awareness is invisible to anyone who reacts first and rationalizes second. For them, it's unnerving because their entire model assumes a standard human response: react, internalize, comply. You didn't. Recognizing manipulation before belief formation is not about being smarter. It's about staying anchored in perception while others drift in persuasion. It's noticing cause and effect while everyone else experiences only effect. That skill makes the scripted moments of control look hollow, the threats look predictable, the promises look performative, and that's why they can't understand you. You didn't need to be told what to think or who to trust. You processed the emotional currents without drowning in them. That freedom of perception, seeing the strings while refusing to be pulled, is what makes someone untouchable in a system built to touch everyone. Once that happens, the machinery itself becomes anxious because it no longer knows how to function around someone who sees the gears turning. Number 5. You saw hierarchy pretending to be enlightenment. In systems like this, authority wears a mask of wisdom. It speaks in grand phrases, promises insight, and frames obedience as a pathway to higher understanding. Most people see this and feel awe, mistaking position for knowledge and privilege for truth. You didn't. You saw the mask. You noticed that those at the top rarely risked exposure to the same rules they enforced, that their enlightenment conveniently aligned with comfort and immunity, and that every lesson they preached often served their own interests more than anyone else's growth. Hierarchy thrives on the illusion that elevation equals insight. It convinces people that being closer to the center of power grants special vision. You looked past the symbols of authority, the titles, the rituals, the reverent tone, and focused on behavior. You saw how decisions were made behind closed doors, how benefits accumulated upward, and how accountability rarely flowed in reverse. That kind of vision is dangerous to them because it strips away the performance that keeps the group obedient. The difference you made was subtle but seismic. While everyone else accepted "he knows more" as enough reason to follow, you weighed action against principle, words against practice, and promises against patterns. You noticed that guidance was often selective, protection was often personal, and rules were often flexible depending on who they applied to. Once you see hierarchy for what it really is, self-preserving and performative, respect becomes optional and fear loses its force. This isn't a philosophical observation. It's a threat to the system because the illusion of wisdom is its lifeblood. They need people to defer, to admire, to internalize the hierarchy as natural and just. When someone refuses to grant that internal assent, the facade trembles. You didn't need to challenge them openly or expose them loudly. Simply seeing them clearly, recognizing that elevation didn't equal enlightenment, and continuing unaffected in your own perception was enough to unsettle them. They can't understand how you reach that clarity without being initiated, flattered, or rewarded. And that is precisely why your awareness became invisible, yet terrifying, because the hierarchy depends on being worshipped, and you were immune. Number 6, you weren't impressed by confidence masquerading as certainty. In groups like this, authority isn't always earned, it's performed. Leaders speak with unwavering conviction, their words delivered with a kind of polished aggression that leaves little room for doubt. Most people mistake that confidence for truth. They hear certainty and assume understanding, and obedience follows almost automatically. You didn't. You listened, but you weighed the content against logic, consistency, and observable behavior rather than the volume or flair with which it was delivered. That difference makes all the difference. Confidence is a tool. It creates a shortcut for compliance. When someone radiates certainty, it signals that questioning is unnecessary, that doubt is risky, that agreement is the easiest path. People get lulled into trust by tone, posture, and presentation rather than by facts. You notice the performance. You notice the rehearsed timing, the selective omission, the way authority was bolstered not by insight but by repetition and expectation. Where others felt convinced, you felt curiosity. Where others felt admiration, you felt analysis. That ability is quietly destabilizing to them. Confidence is their shield. It masks ambiguity, contradictions, and self-interest. When someone refuses to be dazzled by style over substance, the mask falters. They become aware that their usual leverage, swagger, rhetoric, public persona, fails on certain minds. You didn't need to challenge them verbally. Simply refusing to be impressed rewired the interaction. It's subtle but seismic. You saw the distinction between belief and performance, between authority and display, between the claim of knowledge and actual understanding. That awareness is rare because most people are trained to equate the two instinctively. When you break that equation, you operate outside the usual dynamics of control, and that's why they notice. The system assumes people will respond to confidence, that certainty creates submission. You didn't. You measured, observed, and processed without surrendering your own judgment. That refusal to be impressed doesn't just make you independent. It makes you unpredictable, uncontainable, and quietly dangerous to the illusion that their certainty equals truth. Number 7, you didn't outsource your conscience to the group. Most people in tightly controlled systems surrender their inner compass without even realizing it. They adopt the group's moral framework as their own, letting collective judgment dictate right and wrong. It's efficient. It keeps the machinery running. Obedience becomes a shortcut for decision-making, and anyone who questions the system risks being labeled a troublemaker. You didn't. You kept your conscience anchored inside yourself, independent and unbending, even when the current of authority tried to sweep you away. That choice is quietly revolutionary. While others were outsourcing judgment, you measured actions against your own sense of what is fair, ethical, and true. When hypocrisy appeared, you didn't rationalize it. When rules were bent for the privileged, you didn't ignore it. When fear was used to enforce compliance, you felt the weight, but didn't let it override your sense of judgment. That makes you unpredictable, because the system is built on conformity, not insight. Keeping your moral compass intact doesn't require confrontation. You didn't need to call anyone out or announce your independence. Simply noticing, processing, and refusing to participate in unethical behavior while maintaining internal alignment was enough to unsettle them. It's a quiet rebellion, the kind that cannot be easily contained or corrected, because it lives inside you and follows no script. Systems like this rely on internal surrender more than external compliance. When a person retains judgment, the rules begin to falter. Punishments, rewards, and manipulations lose their full effect. Your decisions stop being predictable. Your loyalty cannot be assumed. And that unpredictability is dangerous to the group because it exposes the fragility of authority. What they fear isn't your knowledge, your insight, or even your observation. It's that you still own yourself. You didn't outsource your conscience. You didn't hand it over for validation, for belonging, or for protection. That integrity, silent yet unshakable, is a breach in their architecture. And once someone operates from that place, no amount of indoctrination, intimidation, or charm can bring them back into the fold. Number 8, you noticed how language was engineered to limit thought. Language is the quietest weapon in control. In systems like this, words aren't just for communication. They are designed to shape perception, restrict imagination, and enforce obedience. Specific terms are repeated until they feel natural. Labels are assigned to discourage questioning, and euphemisms are deployed to soften the impact of unethical actions. Most people internalize this without noticing, thinking they are simply learning the culture or understanding the truth. You didn't. You saw the structure beneath the words. You noticed which phrases were meant to shut down thought rather than invite it. You observed how certain words triggered automatic compliance, while others were deliberately avoided because they might spark independent reflection. You noticed the slippery way meanings were bent, so that any resistance appeared wrong, misguided, or dangerous. That awareness gave you a vantage point they never expected anyone to reach without being trained, because most members never pause to examine the tools being used on them. Recognizing language as a control mechanism is more than noticing semantics. It's realizing that thought itself is being shaped before it even forms. They rely on this subtlety because it is invisible to the majority. Once you can see the manipulation, every slogan, mantra, or sacred phrase becomes transparent. Patterns emerge, contradictions appear. The illusion of wisdom, authority, or inevitability cracks open. You didn't need a teacher, a manual, or permission to perceive it. You simply stayed attentive, curious, and unwilling to let words dictate your perception. That's what makes this so dangerous to them. People who notice language as a tool, and not just a carrier of truth, cannot be fully indoctrinated. They can participate, observe, and even appear compliant, but the core mechanism of control has been neutralized, and that is why they fixate on you. Not because you repeated their secrets, but because you understood the framework that allowed their secrets to operate. You didn't just learn their language, you saw the architecture behind it. And once someone sees the architecture, they can never unsee it. Number 9, you sensed urgency as a manipulation tactic, not a warning. Urgency is one of the most effective tools of control because it short-circuits thinking. When people are rushed, they don't reflect, compare, or question. They react. These systems know this well. That's why decisions are framed as now or never, why hesitation is treated as failure, and why delay is painted as danger. Most people confuse urgency with importance. You didn't. You recognized it as pressure wearing the costume of necessity. You noticed the timing. Critical decisions always arrived with emotional weight attached. Fear was heightened, Consequences were exaggerated. Alternatives suddenly disappeared. The message was clear. Act immediately or lose everything. But you paid attention to what urgency always avoided: space for thought. There was never time to sit with the information, verify it, or let it settle. That absence wasn't accidental. It was the point. What made you different is that you slowed down internally, even when the external pressure increased. You didn't need to argue or resist openly. You simply refused to let speed decide for you. That pause broke the spell. Once urgency fails to trigger panic, its power collapses. Promises start sounding rehearsed. Threats start feeling inflated. The emotional leverage weakens. They rely on urgency because truth can withstand patience, but manipulation cannot. Real understanding improves with time. Control weakens with it. You sensed that instinctively. You noticed how urgency appeared whenever logic thinned out, whenever contradictions risked being noticed, whenever compliance was more important than clarity. The faster they pushed, the more obvious it became that something was being protected. This is why they became unsettled. You didn't reject their demands aggressively, and you didn't submit reflexively. You processed at your own pace. That independence disrupts the entire structure because urgency only works on people who surrender their timing. You didn't. And once someone takes ownership of their time and attention, no system built on pressure can fully contain them. Number 10, you observed leaders more than you listened to them. Most people absorb the words of authority like their gospel. They focus on speeches, lectures, and instructions, assuming that understanding comes from listening. You didn't. You watched. You studied behavior, patterns, and contradictions. You paid attention to what leaders did, not just what they said. That kind of observation is rare because it requires detachment, patience, and a willingness to notice discomforting truths that most people ignore in favor of reassurance. You saw the inconsistencies that others excused, the promises made publicly but ignored privately, the rules enforced on some while conveniently overlooked for others, the way influence moved silently behind closed doors, and how power was maintained not by wisdom or fairness, but by fear, favoritism, and performance. Those details don't jump out in a speech. They reveal themselves only to the observer who is willing to look beyond rhetoric and into real-world patterns. Observation without reverence is dangerous to systems built on image. Leaders rely on respect, awe, and authority as tools. When someone looks past the performance, the system is exposed as human, flawed, and self-serving. They become unpredictable, not because you confronted them, but because you refused to be fooled by the illusion of omnipotence. You were a mirror they couldn't ignore. This approach also revealed the mechanics of control. You noticed how attention was directed, how emotional pressure was timed, how obedience was rewarded and doubt punished. You pieced together a map of influence without needing anyone to explain it. That insight is far more powerful than any lecture or lesson because it doesn't depend on permission. It comes from seeing reality as it is. Leaders may speak with conviction, charm, or intimidation, but when someone observes their patterns instead of absorbing their words, the dynamics shift. You weren't just learning information, you were mapping power, and that is profoundly unsettling to them because observation is invisible, relentless, and immune to their usual tactics. You became a presence they couldn't predict, and that alone makes you a force they can't fully contain. Number 11, you didn't confuse belonging with meaning. Most people in closed systems stay because they equate membership with purpose. The group promises identity, significance, and community, and in exchange, it asks for loyalty, conformity, and obedience. For many, the line between belonging and meaning becomes invisible. They confuse comfort with clarity acceptance with understanding. You didn't. You recognized that connection to a system doesn't automatically grant insight, value, or truth. Being part of a group is easy. Finding meaning is hard, and you didn't settle for shortcuts. That distinction gave you independence. While others derived purpose from approval, ritual, or inclusion, you measured significance by alignment with reality, morality, and personal perception. You noticed when actions were performed for appearance rather than effect, when devotion was demanded for control rather than guidance, and when camaraderie masked manipulation. That awareness kept you untethered from the emotional currents designed to bind members together. Belonging is comforting, meaning is demanding. Most people accept the comfort and mistake it for purpose. You didn't. You observed the difference, and in doing so, you exposed a vulnerability in the system. They rely on people mistaking attachment for understanding. When someone refuses that shortcut, the control structure begins to wobble. Decisions stop being predictable, obedience loses its automatic quality, and rituals that once reinforced cohesion reveal themselves as performance rather than enlightenment. You didn't need to reject connection entirely. You could interact, participate, and coexist, but your allegiance was never surrendered. Meaning was internal, belonging was external. That separation allowed you to navigate the group without being consumed by it, to see patterns while others remained emotionally invested, to evaluate motives while others merely followed. This is why your presence is unnerving. They can tolerate critics, outsiders, or rebels. They struggle with someone inside who doesn't confuse participation with purpose, who doesn't accept identity as a substitute for insight. Your understanding bypasses their emotional architecture, and that makes you untouchable in ways they can't predict, measure, or manipulate. Number 12, you realized secrecy was protecting power, not wisdom. Most people assume that hidden knowledge exists because it's sacred, profound, or dangerous to the unprepared. That assumption is what keeps secrecy effective. In reality, most of it isn't wisdom at all. It's power wrapped in the illusion of importance. Rules about who can know, when, and how are not designed to enlighten. They are designed to maintain hierarchy. You saw that. You understood that secrecy was a tool, not a treasure. By recognizing this, you removed one of their strongest levers of control. When information is scarce, people crave access. They obey rules, fear punishment, and accept authority in exchange for inclusion. But once you see that the scarcity is artificial and serves the few rather than the whole, the spell breaks. Knowledge loses its mystique, and with it, the power to manipulate. That realization is quiet but seismic. It undermines the entire system because secrecy is the backbone of influence. You also noticed the patterns secrecy creates. Certain people were always in the know, always shielded, always insulated from accountability. Others were deliberately left in the dark, not because they couldn't handle the information, but because controlling access maintained obedience. You observed how confusion was manufactured, how gaps in knowledge were engineered to produce reliance, fear, and submission, and you understood it without ever being taught. That awareness is dangerous to them because it cannot be contained. Secrecy works because people believe there is something to lose. Once you recognize that the purpose is preservation of privilege, not protection of truth, the power dynamics become obvious. You no longer need approval, access, or initiation to see the system clearly. You see the mechanics of control for what they are, and you remain outside their invisible chains. That is why they fixate on you. Not because you discovered hidden truths, but because you understood why the truths were hidden and didn't need them to validate it. You saw the architecture behind the curtain, and once someone sees that, secrecy no longer protects anything. It only exposes the system itself. Number 13, you treated the group as a system, not a sanctuary. Most people enter groups like this looking for refuge. They want certainty, belonging, or relief from the chaos of thinking alone. Once that emotional contract is formed, the group becomes sacred by default. Its flaws are excused. Its contradictions are defended. Its leaders are protected. You didn't approach it that way. You didn't treat it as a safe haven or a source of meaning. You treated it like a structure that could be observed, tested, and understood. You paid attention to incentives. Who benefited when rules were enforced? Who gained when fear was amplified? Who lost when questions were discouraged? You noticed how rewards and punishments shaped behavior, how loyalty was reinforced, and how dissent was quietly managed. That's not how someone behaves when they're seeking comfort. That's how someone behaves when they're analyzing a system. Seeing it this way stripped away the emotional fog. Rituals stopped feeling sacred and started looking functional. Rules stopped feeling moral and started looking strategic. Even kindness revealed patterns: who received it, when it was given, and what was expected in return. None of this required hostility or rebellion. It required clarity. And clarity is disruptive in environments that depend on emotional dependency. Systems hate being seen as systems, because once you recognize feedback loops and control mechanisms, you stop personalizing the experience. You no longer feel special when praised or ashamed when corrected. You understand the move, not just the message. That understanding makes manipulation inefficient. It also makes your reactions harder to predict. Others were inside the experience. You were studying it. Others were emotionally invested. You were structurally aware. That gap changes everything. You could participate without surrendering judgment. You could listen without absorbing belief. You could remain present without being absorbed. This is what unsettled them. Sanctuaries rely on reverence. Systems collapse under scrutiny. By refusing to grant the group emotional holiness and instead viewing it as an operating structure, you removed its immunity. You didn't attack it. You understood it. And nothing threatens a control-based system more than someone who sees exactly how it works and continues to function outside its emotional reach. Number 14, you trusted your perception even when it isolated you. Most people surrender perception to survive. When everyone around you insists on a certain reality, it becomes easier to align your vision with theirs rather than risk alienation. In closed systems, conformity is rewarded, and independent perception is punished, subtly or overtly. You didn't surrender. You trusted what you saw, felt, and understood, even when it put you at odds with everyone else. That is both rare and profoundly destabilizing to any group that depends on uniform thought. Trusting your own perception in such an environment is not about arrogance or certainty, it's about integrity. You didn't need validation, approval, or consensus to confirm your understanding. When others were swept up in ritual, repetition, or fear, you observed, analyzed, and acted according to your own judgment. That independence made you unpredictable, uncontainable, and quietly dangerous because control systems rely on predictability more than anything else. Isolation is the natural consequence of perception that refuses compromise. You were aware of the social cost, yet you maintained your stance. You didn't join in automatic agreement, and you didn't detach in despair. Instead, you held your center, processing what was happening with clarity, noticing manipulation, hypocrisy, and design, all without bending your perception to fit the narrative. That internal alignment made you resistant to every usual lever of influence: fear, reward, flattery, or punishment. What makes this especially unsettling to them is that perception cannot be stolen, borrowed, or taught. You didn't need access to secret knowledge or privileged insight. You didn't require initiation or instruction. You simply trusted your senses, your judgment, and your understanding. That trust exists entirely inside you, outside their reach. By staying anchored in your own perception, you became both visible and invisible. Visible because your decisions and awareness could not be ignored. Invisible because no one could manipulate the core of how you saw reality. And that is the ultimate threat to a control-based system. Someone whose vision cannot be rewritten, whose understanding cannot be purchased, and whose perception cannot be coerced. You became untouchable not by rebellion, but by fidelity to your own mind. Conclusion. What sets you apart is not luck, talent, or privilege. It's awareness. You saw patterns when others were distracted, questioned what others were trained to accept, and trusted your own perception, even when it isolated you. You recognized manipulation, dissected hierarchy, and understood systems for what they truly are. Every tactic meant to control you, emotional pressure, secrecy, urgency, feigned certainty, failed because you approached the world with clarity, curiosity, and integrity. You didn't need approval to validate what you saw, and you didn't rely on belonging to define your meaning. That combination, observation without bias, conscience without compromise, perception without fear, is what makes someone untouchable in a system built on control. You didn't just survive scrutiny, you revealed the mechanisms behind it. You didn't just resist manipulation, you neutralized it by refusing to play the game. You didn't just see the leaders, you saw the architecture of influence itself. And in doing so, you became invisible and undeniable at the same time, a presence they cannot fully measure, control, or erase. This isn't a story about rebellion. It's a story about clarity, autonomy, and the power of seeing the world honestly, even when the currents of conformity push hard against you. It's a reminder that understanding, integrity, and perception are not granted. They are cultivated. And once they exist, no system, no ideology, and no group can fully contain them. If this resonated with you, if you felt the weight of awareness and the power of seeing clearly, make sure to join the journey. Subscribe to the channel for more insights that challenge the ordinary. Like this video to show your support. Comment to share your perspective. And share it with others who are ready to see beyond the surface. Awareness grows when it's shared, and clarity becomes unstoppable when it spreads. Stay blessed always.